Hey everybody, it's David Jenkins with Fallonville Morrissey Realty. I'm a residential real estate agent here in the North Carolina Triangle. I want to talk for a moment about the big picture process of selling a house. This is from the perspective of a seller. I have another video that gives it from the perspective of a buyer, and also have a lot of little videos that go into components of the process in greater detail. This is just an overview. So the first thing a seller would want to do is pick a listing agent. And hopefully you'd want to pick David Jenkins, but there are a lot of good agents out there. And then the seller and the agent would get the house ready for the market. Now what does that mean? Well, first of all, it might mean decluttering if the house is occupied, and bringing in a stager to move some things around and make sure the rooms all look very nice. If the house is empty, the seller might consider, I recommend it, bringing in a stager to put in some furniture, and that way we can see how the house feels and it photographs much better with furniture in it. And a seller might consider having a pre-listing inspection done to know what problems might be coming down the road, and either repair those problems before a buyer is looking over our shoulder, or to just disclose those problems and say to the buyer, we appreciate you liking the house, it does have these little flaws, and make sure the buyer's okay with that before going under contract with the buyer. Getting the house ready for the market is key. And then the property would be photographed. I think this is extremely important. There's nothing more important in selling your house than having good photographs. So I personally take pictures. I sometimes bring in a second photographer, retake the pictures, move things around, wait for the sun to be a certain way, edit the pictures in post-production. Pictures are critical. And then once we have the house photographed, then the seller would make the final decisions. We got some rough draft decisions up here, but the final decisions about what the price would be and the list date. And what I like to do is go out and preview the other properties that are for sale. So for instance, if this is a $700,000 house in a particular neighborhood, I'll go out and see every house that's between $600,000 and $800,000 in that neighborhood or near it that I think a buyer might be looking at when they look at this house, just to kind of know the competition. We finalize, it's the seller's decision. But I like to, at the last minute, just see what our last minute competition is, and maybe make a slight revision, maybe up, maybe down, maybe stay the same, but fine tune the price right before going it on the market. And also the date. We might put it off a week or move it up a week, depending on various things. We don't want to put a property on the market if it's going to be snowing. We wouldn't want to go on the market on a holiday weekend if we could help it. Ideal time to go on the market might be on a Wednesday or a Thursday. Anyway, then we would put it on MLS, and then it goes to all the other real estate websites around. We make the changes on MLS, and those changes are then automatically disseminated on those other websites. If the seller desires it, and I generally recommend it, we'd have an open house or two to generate some excitement, and a lot of nosy neighbors come through. But there are also some very interested buyers who might see all these nosy neighbors and think, holy mackerel, I need to make an offer quickly on this or it's going to sell fast, not knowing that all the other people there are nosy neighbors. Anyway, there's a lot of reasons to have an open house. I recommend them. And then hopefully an offer would come in, or even better, more than one offer. That's our ultimate goal, representing a seller, is to have a multiple offer situation. And then the seller would usually not just straight out accept the offer, but counter it, or if it's multiple offers, call for best and final offer by 8 p.m. Sunday or 9 a.m. Monday or something like that. And then I would sit with the seller, ideally around the kitchen table type thing, and we would go through those offers and figure out which one would be best for the seller. And maybe fine tune a counter back and forth a few times, and get it finally just right and be under contract, and then change that status on MLS to contingent or pending. The difference being with contingent, we would allow showings to continue in the hope of getting a backup offer, whereas pending, no more showings. And then the seller would receive the check. In North Carolina, we have a due diligence contract. The seller would be receiving a check from the buyer, the due diligence check, and would go ahead and deposit that check. And then we would begin the due diligence period. I ran out of board, but I want to talk more about the due diligence period, where our buyer would be doing inspections and having an appraisal done and things like that. So I'll erase the board if you give me just a second, and we'll talk about the second half. Okay, 8 more things. Here we go. So in North Carolina, a seller is not required to repair anything, but a buyer is not required to buy the house during this due diligence period. So at this point, the buyer and seller are negotiating a due diligence agreement. And that could be that the seller says, I'm not doing anything. Or it could be that the seller says, I'll agree to repair X, Y, and Z. Or I'll agree to lower the purchase price in lieu of making repairs. Or I'll agree to pay a certain amount of the buyer's expenses or closing costs. But anyway, regardless of what that is, we need an agreement to happen to be able to move forward. But we don't have to have repairs done during the due diligence period. We just need the agreement. And then, if there's not a seller possession after closing agreement, at that point the seller begins to pack up and move out. We've gotten past due diligence. At this point, the seller knows if the buyer terminates, not only does the seller get that due diligence fee, they get the earnest money as well. So with a great deal of certainty, more certainty than before, the seller says, this really is going to happen. Let's bring out the boxes, let's pack everything up. And then, if there's an agreement to make repairs, repairs would be made. And then the seller would instruct the utility companies to terminate service as of the day of closing. Now, technically in North Carolina, the purchase contract says that the seller will pay for repairs through the day of closing. But in reality, what we do is almost always is the buyer and seller agree that the seller will terminate utility service on the day of closing. The buyer will start utility service in their name on the day of closing. And then the seller would sign the seller documents, the deed and lien waiver, in front of a notary. This is if the seller is not coming to closing. In North Carolina, I would say 90% of the time, the seller is not coming to closing. So these documents would not have a monetary amount on them, so it's not something that is going to change. It can be done well in advance. And then the property is made ready for a final walkthrough, and it would be in the same or roughly the same condition as it was when the buyer saw it and made their offer. And then the seller would make sure to remove their personal property. Now, if there's some old tires and cinder blocks in the garage or in the storage shed, it's not okay for a seller to say, well, those things were there when I bought the house. No, please don't do that, because then your hardworking agent's going to be moving those things. So if it's personal property and it's not in the contract that it's supposed to stay with the house, the seller needs to get all the personal property out before the final walkthrough. And then when the final closing disclosure is ready, that's with the monetary amounts on it, then that would be signed, does not need to be notarized. And in fact, if a seller would like, I can go over it as their agent with them on the phone, and as long as everybody agrees the numbers are accurate, then that can be signed DocuSign, or with a power of attorney, I could sign it for the seller. And then there's the closing, where the buyer is signing, and the seller may have signed all their papers. The seller would be at the closing. Sometimes I'm not at the closing unless I'm just there to congratulate the buyers or something. And then the closing attorney would wire the net proceeds to the seller, or if the seller prefers, overnight a check to the seller, or the seller could come by the attorney's office to pick up that check. But the check will not be ready at the closing. The check is ready, or the wire is ready, once the attorney has recorded the deed, which is going to take place usually several hours after the closing. And that's the big overview of the selling process. I hope that's helpful. If I could answer any questions about that or anything else to do with the purchase or sale of residential real estate in North Carolina, please give me a call. My information is below. Thank you.